Welcome back, Honors. All right. Pleasure to see you. Good job today, right? Was very impressed with how well y'all did on your map quiz, which was really, really awesome, right? I think literally the average was like in the 96s, right? You got a little quiet a little bit today, but of course, like, I'm the huge dork, and I'm the one that thinks that, like, the hoplites and the archaic Greeks and their warfare methods are super intense, right? But you do need to highlight a couple of things that we talked about today in class. One, you need to highlight the fact that every Greek soldier was known as a hoplite, so every one of these people in this system is called a hoplite. Then you also need to actually highlight the thing that this is called, the phalanx system, right? That is going to be a main tool of warfare for the Greeks, especially during the Persian invasions, which I'm not going to spoil the end of the story, but it's going to become a very, very big deal, right? Now, one last thing that all archaic Greeks shared is this concept of colonization, right? So we left off in class talking about the warfare models of archaic Greeks, and now we're talking about the common principle of colonization for the Greeks, right? Now, the big thing about it is Greeks began to colonize, and actually the city-states began to grow rapidly, and they ended up actually setting up colonies all over the place, right? So not in the sense that you actually think of being like, oh, a colony is going to send money back to blah, blah, blah. When the city-states began to grow, some Greeks began to strike out and use their technology and their shipbuilding technology that actually set up colonies all over the place, right? So this is a map right here of Greek colonization. Now, this idea is not going to be crazy important for this unit, but it's actually going to be super important for the next one, all right? So just kind of highlight Greek colonization or circle it really quick, and just so you know going into it, right around the time that old little Rome is just this baby little fledgling thing, this tiny little mud hut city that nobody even thinks about, the Greeks already existed in Italy, right? So that'll give us a little bit of help when we're trying to understand why Romans share so many cultural ties with Greeks, right? So that colonization principle is very important. But now we're getting into the better stuff. Now we're getting into the intense stuff. Now we're getting into the things that are absolutely awesome. We're getting into the rise of Athens and Sparta, right? This is the core concept of the Archaic period, right? Yes, the Archaic period began with the first Olympics. Yes, we know that the Athenians and the Spartans were originally settled during the Dark Ages, but during the Archaic period would be their rise to prominence, their rise to cultural growth, their rise to their own ideals, right? And the very first group we're going to talk about, the first ones, are the Spartans, right? The Spartans, the warrior society. Sorry, I love this guy. He makes me so happy. I want a little Spartan Lego man so bad, right? He looks like he's been doing so many sit-ups. He's got an 8-pack. It's ridiculous. And I don't know if these are laurel wreaths or like chest hair. But like, anyway, so that right there, obviously, when we're looking at this little guy, when we're talking about the Spartans, what does Spartan life revolve around? That revolves around the idea of their military and their warrior-like society, right? Sparta is defined by their ability to wage war, right? Now, they were originally, apparently, during the Dark Ages, settled by the people that showed up and possibly destroyed the Mycenaeans, right? The Dorians, right? That makes complete sense when you think about it, right? These Dorians came in and settled, and due to geographic isolation, they began to create a common culture of religion, and it was all based loosely off of the remnants of Hesiod or Hesiod, or however you say the man's name, whatever. The gods that were established in that archaic common period, right? And they're going to start establishing some very, very key important things, right? But just so you know, going forward, if you were a Spartan and you were a Spartan male, you had one job, right? One job alone. And that was to grow into becoming a soldier. Hands down. There was no alternative jobs in Sparta. If you were a male and you were healthy and you were born the way that they wanted you to be born, we'll get into that here in a second, you must become a soldier, right? So if Mr. Mather and Mr. Wooderson and I were all born in ancient Sparta, what will our jobs be in ancient Sparta? We will all be soldiers. Now, I want you to imagine just for like 2 seconds, Mr. Terry wearing this getup, and I think I would look just dashing with a cape, right? So now, but the big thing is, but here's the thing. Some of y'all are probably asking yourself a little bit, one of y'all is like Tiana probably, or Rachel right now is probably like, wait a minute. How do they have an economy or how do they farm, or how do they do any of that stuff if all the men go off and become soldiers? And some of you are probably like, well, do they make the women do it? Nah, women are important. They need women to create more soldiers, right? So what are you going to do? The way their economy functioned was actually they turned people they took over into these slaves called helots, right? So, or helots. And that is right there. You need to highlight that word. It's very, very important because these people pop up throughout throughout the timeline of archaic, classical, and Hellenistic periods, right? So these helots would be actually taken from other neighboring cities or towns that they took over, and their fittest men would actually be the ones that would be forced to farm, be forced to create pots and goods, or smith for them, or create the weapons, while the men went off to become soldiers, right? So the helots farmed, which let all other Spartan men become soldiers, right? Now, the other intense thing about it is some of you are probably thinking, it's like, well, if they're this soldier-like, if they're this militaristic, are they super, super intense in the terms of, I don't know, give or take, government, right? So now their government was actually pretty amazing due to the fact that they created a government that shares its relation more with the Roman Republic than it does with the Athenian democracy, right? So the Spartan government was led by 2 kings and a council of elders called ephors, right? E-P-H-O-R-S, ephors. Write those down, okay? Now, these ephors were elected from every single city. Wait a minute, back up, right? Every city and their citizens of their city, which were all males over the age of 30, right? They chose these ephors in a very primitive, not an intense system of voting per se, but they elected these ephors. So that means that the Athenians did not know, right? Everybody gives credit to the Athenians for creating democracy, but it's straight up not true. The Spartans actually invented democracy first, right? Because they would elect these ephors, and the ephors would advise these 2 kings. One king was there to rule the political end, and the other king was there to rule the military, right? The secondary king was always the general, right? The general of the military. Now, the intense part about it, too, what is so smart about having 2 kings? You have a check and a balance now, right? No one king can have complete control and derail the entire Spartan society, because if he decides that he wants to do something, the other king can talk him out of it, or they can come to an equal agreement, right? And all citizens who elected these ephors were Spartan-born males over the age of 30. Everyone else is considered a subject of the Spartan kingdom, right? Now, also really, really quick, something you need to jot down, their patron god and goddess, right? Their patron god and goddess were Ares and Artemis. They had temples to both of them within the Spartan capital, right? So the big thing about it, though, is what did we get from this slide, right? They're settled by the Dorians. They had these helots that are very, very important to their economy. They had 2 kings and a council of elders called ephors, and these ephors and their elections are the very first uses of democracy. Get it? This is Sparta, and he's pointing at it. That's awesome. Now, anyway, so other things that we have to discuss as well is now all the cultural aspects of Sparta, right? We have to discuss, wait a second, so if your life revolves around being in the military, then how the heck do you function as a regular society? What are aspects of your culture? Well, apparently, every single newborn in Sparta was checked for health and deformities, right? So let's say hypothetically that, I don't know, my wife, not my wife, we can't use this in this situation. Let's say hypothetically, who's somebody I would have? Let's say Mr. Wooderson had a baby, right? Well, he didn't have a baby, but his wife had a baby, right? They had a baby, and they decided to name him Clarence, right? So, and they live in Sparta, and they had this little baby Clarence. Apparently, what would happen is I, the government inspector, would show up, and I would pick up little Clarence, right? Oh, look at little Clarence. Look at him. He's a big, he weighs 6 ounces, right? But apparently I would then take this baby out into the woods, and I would actually look at him, and I'd be like, well, Clarence doesn't have legs, he doesn't have arms, and he also doesn't have a head. And he looks conspicuously a lot like a football. So I would deem that this child will never be able to grow up to be a Spartan warrior or a healthy woman that will produce Spartan warriors. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to leave him out in the woods, right? They would abandon the children that are actually not of proper birthing, actually, if they were deformed or underweight, they would abandon them in the woods to die, right? So, but if you were a child that survived this inspection process, at the age of 7, you as a boy would go off to actually enjoy your military training. And I know what some of y'all are saying, 7 years old, I got a brother who's 7. If it took him away from our mom, I think he'd cry big time. Well, in Spartan society, this was an honor, right? So the boys were ready to leave home at the age of 7 because every Spartan male before them left home at the age of 7, right? So the big thing about it is you have to understand is this element of their society was not really cruel. It was just a part of their entire culture, right? And the first day that you got there, you were told to disrobe, and you went out into the yard, and you actually learned how to fight without any armor on whatsoever, right? Your training began day 1. You then were moved into these things known as a barracks, right? And a barracks is a large military complex where the soldiers sleep, right? And you had to live in that barracks for an extremely long amount of time, about 23 years, but we'll talk about that here in a second, right? They moved into the barracks, and they were toughened up heavily by a coarse diet, hard exercise, and extremely rigid discipline, right? Now, the diet is really interesting. Hold on, I got to go get Clarence, right? The diet is extremely interesting, right? So, I'm sure a lot of y'all are thinking, like, oh, what do they eat? What do they feed the Spartan boys? What do they feed the recruits, right? Some of you are probably saying to yourself, oh, maybe they fed them like olives and, goat cheese because they had access to those things. Or maybe they fed them like bread or something like that because most ancient people ate bread, right? Did they feed them those things? Actually, funnily enough, no. The main premise of the Spartan diet was blood soup. They would actually take a pig, and they would slaughter a pig, and they'd slaughter it upside down, right? And they would allow the pig's blood to drain into a huge pot, right? They would then take that pot of blood, mix that with vinegar, and throw a couple of pig legs inside of it, and cook that down into this kind of smoothie-like consistency blood soup, and they would actually feed the boys that, right? Now, really quickly, though, I don't know about y'all, but blood soup doesn't sound like that appetizing. Now, what do we think the officers ate? Oh, well, the officers ate in the training, like the drill sergeants or the sergeants of the Spartan military, the ones in charge of training the boys, they ate fantastically. They ate the rest of the pig, right? They ate everything good. Any oats or wheats, grains, meat, they were fed really well every day. This was to encourage the boys to steal, right? They wanted the boys to try and steal from them, to develop their sneakiness and cunning. Because a boy that could actually steal from them and not get caught was a boy that they wanted in the Spartan military, right? To develop their ingenuity and their understanding, right? There's actually a very famous story about a very special Spartan boy that apparently was the best at stealing. And he became the model of all of the Spartan boys for the rest of Spartan society, right? He was like the epitome, the mythical Spartan boy, right? So really, really quickly, remind me in class. Somebody jot it down. Mr. Terry has to tell the story about the Spartan kid. All right, so and then I'll remember to tell you, okay? But to continue to roll forward, right? At the age of 20, once they had been in military training for 13 years, Spartan men were allowed to get married, right? Their marriages were arranged. They were chosen by the parents of the wife and then the son. And the unfortunate part about it is, yes, they were allowed to get married at the age of 20, but they had to live in the barracks for another 10 years, right? So they couldn't even live outside the barracks until they were 30 years old, right? Now, some of y'all are talking about, well, oh, you just said that they got married. So do Spartan women have a prevalence in their society as well? Actually, they do, right? Spartan women were actually a very, very interesting group in Greece because they had some of the most rights out of any group of women in Greece, right? Women in Sparta had to do certain things, right? Some of you are like, well, did the women have to learn how to military train? Did they have to learn how to fight? Well, the way that Spartan warriors viewed women was they needed strong women to produce strong warriors. So every single day, women would be required to show up in a square together in each Spartan town or village, and they would have to work out or exercise or strengthen their bodies so they could believe to be able to be producing strong warriors, right? Now, they could also, though, this is a really interesting premise, if a woman lost her husband in battle, right, because all of them are going off to be soldiers, she inherited their property. Whereas in Athens, the father of, or the closest living relative of the male that died was the one that inherited the property, right? the woman was then sent back to their father's home in Athens and actually considered just like kind of damaged goods, if you will. But the big thing is Spartan women had much more rights. Spartan women could initiate divorce in Spartan society. Spartan women actually, there are two people in Spartan society that received headstones when they died, right? When they died, they would actually receive a gravestone marking where their body was buried. Just two people, two kinds of people. One of them was a Spartan warrior who died in battle, right? And if you died in battle, every single one of your brothers in arms would find your body on the battlefield, and they would take you and then lay you upon your own shield. And then they would pick you up on your shield and they would walk you home, right? Laying on your shield, you would arrive back in Sparta where you would be given a warrior's death and a warrior's funeral, and you would actually be laid to rest with a tombstone marking your contribution to the Spartan kingdom. The only other people that got headstones in Sparta were women who died in childbirth, right? Now, that's a very interesting premise because it gives us some insight into how women operated in Sparta and how they were actually revered and looked at as much, much, much more even than others, right? Now, Sparta, though, due to all of these cultural ideas, are going to isolate themselves away from a lot of the other Greeks, right? Because this warrior-like culture is not going to be like the trade empire that Athens would grow into being, right? Sparta isolated themselves from other Greeks, and citizens were not allowed to travel, right? They were discouraged from trading, and this made them very, very unique because of this cultural, this geographic isolation. It also made them very deadly. Right? So going forward, though, so that is Sparta. That's nuts and bolts, the Spartan culture, kind of their early foundings in the Archaic period, because we understand several important things about them. We get their government now. We understand a lot of other different ideas about them. But you have to understand that Athens is like the opposite, right? Athens is the one that's very close by geographically. Actually, Sparta is located on Peloponnese, the mainland region of Greece, and Athens is also located on mainland Greece and Peloponnese, but it's actually not very, very far away. Now, for two places to be this close and be so different is absolutely wild, right? Now, this right here, of course, is the Acropolis of Athens. So whenever we're talking about Athens, we already know that Athens focuses more on its intelligence and focuses a lot less on its actual military stylings, right? So they claimed that they were not settled by the Dorians. They claimed that they were settled by a different group of people called the Ionians, right? Because the Athenians could never be associated with the people that led to the downfall of Western civilization, right? They could not be associated with the dirty, rotten Dorians because they were a little bit more uppity than that. Ionians, on the other hand, were somebody to them that were like, oh, well, according to the Athenians, the Ionians apparently just sprang up out of the ground and founded the city of Athens. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But it also is important to actually understand that the Athenians literally truly believed that they were separate, different, and better than most other Greeks, right? Now, what they're going to start out as is also one of the most unfair governments on the planet. Granted, yes, Sparta was like all about their military. They were much more about their generals. They were much more about their two kings and their council of ephors, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is Athenians actually started out as an aristocracy, right? As the Ionian colony, quote-unquote Ionian colony of Athens began to grow, it ended up showing up that a lot of them were getting very, very wealthy, right? And so they started out as this idea called an aristocracy, right? An aristocracy is when only the wealthy landowners are in charge, right? Now, eventually, as time rolls forward, this is very important that you understand, is they evolved into something like an oligarchy, right? An oligarchy is where the wealthiest of the wealthiest citizens are now in charge. So you just went from an aristocracy, which is already unfair because you're just saying if you don't have money, you can't be in politics. Then you transformed into an oligarchy where only the super rich of that aristocracy are now, like the wealthiest of the wealthy are now in charge. So it's just a smaller group of wealthy citizens. But some of you are saying, but Mr. Terry, in Miss Texas class, because she's one of the best teachers around, it's like at Archbishop Chappelle High School, which is 1,000% true, we learned that Athens sowed the seeds of democracy, right? They didn't start out that way, though, right? Because under this aristocracy and under this oligarchy, wealth in Athens is going to grow extremely fast, right? And especially among the upper class. The thing about it is they are going to continue to grow, and they're going to start pulling in other small Greek settlements, right, to form one large city-state that would be ruled by this oligarchical power, right? Now, the issue with all this stuff, though, is that problems are going to arise with this oligarchy, right? And they're going to need to be changed, right? Because Athens grew far too large, far too fast. And it's going to start struggling to feed itself, right? Now, the big thing about where I'm getting with this is the Athenians were ruled by this oligarchical power, by these wealthy citizens, right? Started as that aristocracy, changed into an oligarchy, and Athens had grown so large so quickly that they had struggled to actually figure out how to appropriately farm to feed a populace of that size, right? And since their wealth grew so fast, their wealthy numbers grew along with it, their poor grew along with it, but they only had so many farmers to provide food and surpluses for the entire city-state in the form of taxation and tribute, right? So this led to a famine that showed up in Athens. And the problem is that the poor are going to be struggling to feed themselves, and they're going to grow furious, right? But on top of all this, one of the reasons why the poor were so furious is because of the system of debt slavery, right? In Athens, they had a system of slavery that actually enslaved the poor. Not foreigners, not people they took over, not like making the helots farm for Sparta because they took you over and they just beat you in battle. The Athenians adopted a concept of debt slavery, where they would force farmers to buy goods from them, and or if they didn't have enough farm goods to pay their taxes with, right? Remember when we talked about Egypt? Egyptians paid their taxes in grains and things. The Athenians did the same thing. They actually paid their taxes in the form of grains or agricultural crop yields, right? And if they didn't have enough, the aristocracy or the oligarchy, the people who owned the land the farmers worked on, would put them into debt. And this debt was impossible to get out from under. And where was the debt actually inscribed? On this thing known as a horos, right? A stone, a very, very large stone that sat next to your house that told you how much you owed the man who owned that land every single day. That is so messed up because every now and again, crop yields are just not going to do that well. You cannot sit there and force the poor laboring class to actually keep paying debts back that they'll never be able to pay back, right? So the aristocrats are going to start fighting each other for power, and they're going to turn into these things called tyrants, right? Aristocrats are going to begin to elect themselves during times of crisis, and Athens is going to start being led by a person called a tyrant, right? So you went from an aristocracy to an oligarchy to being led by a tyrant, right? And a tyrant is an aggressive ruler. An aggressive ruler that actually takes no ifs or qualms about the issues of the poor. He does not care, and he wants to move forward, and he expects you to pay your taxes and your debts on time, and if you're not going to do it, you're just going to stay forever enslaved to the aristocracy of the Athenians. This system is so jacked up that this one dude who is considered the father of modern-day government, the father of democracy, shows up. And to dispose of the tyrants, the man by the name of Solon takes Athens to what they would become. All right, so sorry about that. We had to wait for the announcements to finish up, right? But this guy, Solon, is going to show up, and he is going to take the tyrants down, right? So they started out as an aristocracy. They turned into an oligarchy. And then one of those leaders of the oligarchy turned themselves into a tyrant. The problem with tyrants is they believed that their children will adopt their ruling after them, right? It turned it into a hierarchical power and a hereditary-based rulership, right? But Solon would be appointed as the Archon of Athens in 594 BC, right? And he is considered the father of modern-day government because he literally created a system that outlawed the debt slavery. He got rid of the horos and said that they should all be destroyed, right? And he also told all of the farmers, stop trying to grow all of this different stuff and this different wheat. Instead, grow just olives that we can make into olive oil, and then we can use to actually trade with other people and bring these goods into our country, right? He pushed Athens towards a democracy. He created some of the earliest systems of voting, right? Some of you are probably actually asking, well, how did he do this, right? How did he actually make this actually happen? Well, a big thing is he's gonna go back to the aristocratic roots, and he's gonna make the leadership based on wealth, not lineage, to get rid of some of these tyrants, right? And then Athens is going to, following Solon's reforms, are going to go through several other leaders, right? So he got rid of debt slavery, and he got rid of the horos, and he got rid of the tyrannical leaders, and he created a system of voting. And the coolest thing about the voting is actually really, really neat, is that apparently Athenians would vote by walking up to different piles of colored rocks, right? And you would actually pick the rock that's associated with the person that you wanted to vote for, and you would drop that rock in a pot, and then they would break the pot open, and then they would just count up all the rocks, and that's who that you actually chose. And so he created systems of ostracism. He created systems of electing archons more efficiently. And he's considered the father of modern-day government. And after he resigned, after getting rid of the tyranny that existed in Athens and going back to more systematic views of voting, adopting systems of voting, and actually creating a system of allowing the people to have a say in their government, Athens, yes, is going to go through some good and bad leaders, right? Apparently Solon, when he left, said, you do not have to commit to my reforms forever, but you have to stick to them for at least 10 years, right? And apparently a bunch of leaders popped up that were really bad. There were some ones that were really good, like Cleisthenes was a very, very good leader. And after Cleisthenes and a few other rebellions, Solon's reforms are going to finally be realized, right? Now, the Athenians could have done it 30 years earlier, but Solon's original ideas of creating an Athenian democracy where everyone, as long as you weren't a woman or a slave, was allowed to vote, as long as you were of voting age, was allowed to vote, right? And he, again, created a system so they could each vote, like using their little colored rocks, and they could actually vote in the system. And they would elect councils of archons, right? That would help rule over the entire city-state. Ostracism is going to be a really, really intense thing they're going to adopt, which is actually, if a ruler is being terrible, you could kick them out or exile them from Athens for a certain amount of time before they were allowed to return, to give people the ability to fix the government and the damage that had been done to Athens, right? So this ostracism concept is very important. Go ahead and highlight that or circle it. And then Athens is also going to be divided into a series of tribes, kind of like regional states, right? So it's going to be divided up into a series of tribes, and tribes would then elect archons, and archons would create these councils, right? And this new government made people like Sparta furious, right? Because Sparta thought that democracy was fine if you were electing elders who had business being able to advise kings. They thought that was good. They did not like the idea of giving a voice to all these other people, right? The Spartans were furious, and this is going to be the seed of their rivalry. Right? The big rivalry of Sparta is going to be like, you're telling me that you're going to allow those dummies over there to vote and decide on their own leaders? No, this is not how this happens. We work in a military style where our generals and the former leaders that have already been there are the ones who will be having the authority. Because what if some idiot runs and convinces everybody to vote for him, right? So yes, the Athenian democracy has its fallbacks and whatnot, and so does the Spartan government. But the developments of the Athenian democracy under the reforms of Solon are very important, right? Coming from all that stuff, I know it's intense, but debt slavery, horos, ostracism, those are really, really big important concepts to know. Now, Athenian women is another important thing as well. Athenian women were absolutely mistreated to above and beyond in Athens, like you wouldn't believe, right? They were not allowed to participate in politics. They had to run the household. They're essential objects for religious rituals. They weren't even allowed to leave the house without a male escort. So for everything great that Athenian men did to reform a government and make it better, they did not treat their women well at all. Women in Sparta were considered to have more freedom than women inside of Athens, right? And this is going to lead to a lot of negativity that shows up a little bit later on. Apparently, the only place in Athens that you were allowed to go without actually having to ask a man's permission was to the well to actually receive water. And then I'm going to show you one last thing. We're going to talk about Athenian education, though, which is a very important thing. And Athenians are going to have a very, very intense system of education. They're going to create a system of education that is multifaceted, where only boys are going to attend school if the family could afford it, and they're going to learn to read, write, they're going to study music, they're going to memorize poetry, and they're also going to become public speakers. And a lot of that is so that they could eventually possibly one day participate in politics, right? Possibly in the democratic system of Athens. They received some, but very little military training. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, and we'll review this stuff tomorrow. I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.